Just as a teacher's words became unbearable, an unexpected voice rose up and left the world in shock. The auditorium buzzed with energy as students filed in, some clearing notifications, others shaking coffee cups. It was just another Sunday at Whitmore University, a prestigious campus in the heart of Oregon. In room 302, a class on cultural criticism was about to begin, taught by the renowned Professor Eleanor Grayson, known as both an admirer and a controversial one. Grayson was known for her incisive critiques and blunt opinions, often using public figures as examples to discuss social norms. In the third row, a young man stood out, though few recognized him. Tall and introspective, with a quiet disdain that fooled observers, Barron Trump sat, trying to blend in. He wore a denim shirt and kept his hair slightly disheveled, as if to avoid attracting attention. His presence was no coincidence. Barron had enrolled in college under an assumed name, seeking anonymity. Despite his family's fame, he longed for a normal life, where he could think for himself without the shadow of his last name. As the students settled in, Professor Grayson walked up to the podium, her imposing presence silencing the murmurs almost instantly. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice cool and confident. "Today, we're going to explore the concept of public image, how it's constructed, manipulated, and sometimes dismantled. And we're going to use some real-life examples." Barron shifted, his expression neutral. He didn't know what to expect, but he could already feel the weight of the moment. What followed, however, would change the room in ways no one could have predicted. Professor Eleanor Grayson wasn't just an academic. She was a force of nature. With a PhD from Stanford and a prolific career in cultural analysis, she had built a reputation for her scathing critiques of social hypocrisy. Her lectures often went viral, shared as both glowing reviews and polarizing words. Students paid dearly for her classes, eager for the intellectual debates she promised. Today would be no different. As Grayson began, she used examples of influential figures, delving deeply into the contrast between their public personas and the underlying realities. Her words were clear and deliberate, but it wasn't long before her tone changed, and she mentioned a name that immediately caught Barron's attention. "Take Melania Trump, for example," she said, striding across the stage with the confidence of someone completely in control. "A woman celebrated for her elegance and beauty, but what does that say about our collective standards? Are we so shallow that beauty and silence become virtues to be celebrated?" A murmur spread through the room. Some students laughed, others exchanged nervous glances. Barron felt a chill on the back of his neck, but he kept his face impassive. Grayson continued, his words now laced with sarcasm. "What about intelligence, contribution, influence through substance rather than surface? Is this really the image we want to maintain for young women today?" Barron looked at the table in front of him, his mind racing. He had come into the class curious about academia and intellectual discourse, but now he felt a growing uncertainty, not because he disagreed with the concept, but because he felt personally affected. His classmates seemed amused, some even laughing at Grayson's words. She had a way of making her words sound like absolute truths, and the room was drawn in by her critique. But for Barron, this wasn't just a class, it was a challenge. A line had been crossed, and he wasn't sure he could let it go. Professor Grayson didn't stop there. She went back to talking about Melania Trump, dissecting her every move, from her choice of words and speeches to her famous quote that said, "I really don't care, do you?" The students were riveted, captivated by her biting commentary. "She's a symbol," Grayson declared, gesturing for emphasis. But a symbol of what? Of a lost era where women were expected to stand silently behind powerful men, smiling and saying nothing of substance. Some students laughed, others murmured in agreement. The energy in the room grew as Grayson continued his tirade. "It's fascinating," he added, his voice gaining a brightness, "how easily we mistake silence for grace and complacency for class. What message are we sending to the next generation?" Barron's hands tightened on the legs of the chair. The teacher wasn't just criticizing a public figure, she was attacking her mother. For years, he had watched Melania be judged and ridiculed. People saw only her image, her modeling past, or her accent, and used her as a target for their criticism. But to him, she was much more than that. A smart, private woman who protected her family with quiet strength. Grayson's words sounded like an attack not just on his mother, but on the values she represented. "What if," Grayson continued, his voice shining with sarcasm, "we celebrated women who really make a difference, instead of those who just wear designer clothes?" The room erupted in laughter, and Barron felt a sharp blow to his chest. He scanned the faces of his classmates. Some were amused, others indifferent, but none seemed to question the validity of his argument. And yet, he remained silent. For now, he could not tell if it was fear, respect for his teacher, or the weight of being in an environment where his family name was nearly untouchable. But deep down, a spark of resolve began to burn. Grayson continued, each word more pointed. "Let's not forget the irony," she said, turning to the class with a smile. "A woman whose public statements are sparse but include phrases like, 'be better.' A slogan so grammatically strange it makes you wonder if it reflects a lack of understanding or a lack of care." The room erupted again, the laughter louder this time. Barron felt his face flush, his heart pounding. It wasn't anger. It was something more complex. Challenge. Frustration. The realization that for all her intelligence, Professor Grayson was using her platform to humiliate someone who wasn't there to defend herself. Her mind raced through the lessons her parents had taught her. Keep her composure, never escalate, and let actions speak louder than words. But this was no time for silence. For years, Barron had stayed out of the spotlight, letting his family deal with public opinion, criticism, and sometimes hostility. And now, sitting in this room, he felt a responsibility not just to his mother, but to the concept of justice itself. He took a deep breath, his hands outstretched on the table. Slowly, he raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was calm and deliberate, almost as if time had slowed down. The teacher paused mid-sentence, her gaze deepening as she caught sight of him. "Yes?" she asked, her tone softening, as if embarrassed by the interruption. Barron stood, his movements graceful but firm. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes on him. The laughter had evaporated, replaced by palpable curiosity. No one recognized him yet, but his commanding presence demanded attention. "I think you're missing something important," he said, his voice steady, every word clear and deliberate. There was no anger in his tone, no defensiveness, just a quiet confidence that made everyone lean in to listen. And as his words began to flow, it became clear that Barron Trump wasn't just defending his mother. He was redefining the entire conversation. "You talk about my mother as if she were just an image, a caricature of what society wants her to be," Barron said, his voice firm but unaffected. "But have you ever stopped to consider the humanity behind the headlines?" The teacher stepped back, taken aback by the interruption. A few students exchanged glances, unsure of where this was going. "My mother grew up in a small town in Slovenia, in a family that didn't have much," Barron continued, his tone measured but firm. "She worked hard to make something of herself, navigating a world where people judged her for everything. Her accent, her looks, her background. And yet, she succeeded. She became a model, learned 5 languages, and eventually became the First Lady of the United States. Not because she sought fame or power, but because she believed in her family and its values." A murmur spread through the room. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, drawn in by the unexpected depth of his words. Barron's voice never wavered. His gaze shifted to Professor Grayson. "You say she represents outdated ideals, but maybe the problem isn't with her," he continued. "Maybe it's how we, as a society, decide what's worth celebrating. You criticize her for being silent, but isn't there strength in choosing your words carefully? In speaking only when you have something meaningful to say?" The room was completely silent now, the weight of her words settling over the students like a heavy blanket. Even Professor Grayson, known for her quick comebacks, looked momentarily stunned. "And let's not pretend," Barron said, "that public figures like my mother don't pay a price for everything they do. Every smile, every gesture, every mistake is dissected, criticized, and judged by people who have never walked a day in their shoes. We are quick to judge, but slow to consider the cost of living under that microscope." He paused, letting the room absorb his words. For the first time, the students saw not just a student, but someone who carried the weight of experiences they could barely comprehend. But Barron wasn't done yet. What came next challenged not only the teacher, but everyone in the room to think differently. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in time, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Then, a slow clap broke the silence, followed by a soft sound of reactions. Some students remained frozen, their eyes wide with surprise, while others exchanged glances that ranged from impressed to uncomfortable. Barron's words had cut through the air in a way no one had anticipated. Professor Grayson, usually quick to regain control, hesitated. Her confidence wavered for only a second before she regained her composure. "Those are interesting points," she said, her tone measured but sagging into defensiveness. "But isn't it fair to scrutinize public figures? especially when they hold positions that influence millions. Barron responded with a calm expression. It's fair to scrutinize actions, but what you're doing isn't scrutiny. It's mockery. It's easy to judge someone by their outward appearance, but it's harder to understand their full story. What if we shifted the conversation to the values behind the image, instead of dismantling the person? The teacher opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Some students began to applaud, a tentative sound at first, then growing louder. One by one, others joined in, until the room was filled with applause. The sound was more than just approval. It was a release of tension, a recognition that something extraordinary had happened. A student in the back raised his hand. I never thought about it that way, he admitted. Maybe we're too quick to judge people we don't know. Another added, yes, it's easy to point fingers, but we forget that public figures are still human beings. The impact of Barron's words was undeniable. Grayson, now standing silently at the podium, looked around the room. It was clear that the dynamic had changed. What had started as a lecture had turned into a conversation, a real exchange of ideas that she hadn't expected. Barron sat silently, his presence no longer anonymous. He didn't smile or betray his attention. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost introspective, as the applause died down. But this moment wasn't just about applause. It was about the lasting impression Barron's response would leave on everyone in the room. The class ended, but the energy in the room lingered like an echo. The students gathered their things slowly, mulling over the exchange in their minds. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone challenge Professor Grayson in a way that didn't feel combative, but transformative. Barron packed his things quietly, keeping his head down. A few students approached him hesitantly. Hey, that was brave, one of them said, his voice thick with admiration. You really made me think about things differently. He smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. He didn't say much. He wasn't there to brag. His goal wasn't to win an argument. He was to change the conversation. And judging by the discussions around him, he had succeeded. Meanwhile, Professor Grayson remained at the podium, flipping through her notes as if searching for something to hold on to. A few students approached her with questions, but even she seemed less confident than usual. As she left the classroom, her expression was one of contemplation, not triumph. The impact of the moment did not stop at the auditorium doors. In the following days, news of the conversation began to circulate on social media. A student recorded part of Barron's response and shared it online with the caption, "When the quietest person in the room changes everything." Within hours, the clip gained traction, sparking debates and comment sections about respect, public perception, and the power of standing up for what you believe in. Across campus, students debated what had happened. Had Grayson gone too far? Was Barron right to speak out? For the first time in a long time, the focus wasn't on gossip or superficial issues. It was on meaningful conversations about values, judgment, and humanity. Professor Grayson, known for her wit, found herself replaying Barron's words in her mind after class ended. That evening, as she prepared for the next class, she paused, looking at her notes. Something about her usual approach felt wrong now, even hollow. For all her criticism of public figures, she realized she had forgotten an essential truth. Compassion is not a weakness, it is a strength. But that was just the beginning. What began as a single moment in a classroom was about to spread far beyond the university walls. A week later, the classroom was full again. But this time, the energy was different. The students arrived early, filling the seats and talking in hushed tones about the previous week's confrontation. Professor Grayson stood at the podium, her usual commanding presence tempered with humility. She opened the class by addressing the moment that had clearly left its mark. Last week, something remarkable happened in this room, she began, her voice strong but reflective. I was challenged in a way that made me reconsider not only my arguments but my approach to teaching. And for that, I owe all of you, especially one of you, my gratitude. The room was silent, caught up in her unexpected candor. Criticism is important, he continued, but so is understanding. We cannot truly analyze or challenge social norms without empathy. Last week, I failed to extend that empathy to the object of my criticism. So I apologize. Barron, sitting in his usual spot, offered a small nod of acknowledgement. He didn't need a grand gesture. The change in tone was enough. The events of that day didn't end in the classroom. They sparked a broader campus-wide conversation about how we engage with ideas, public figures, and each other. Students began questioning not just the topics of their debates, but the way they approached them. Social media lit up with conversations about the importance of fairness and respect, even in criticism. For Barron, life went on quietly, just as he preferred. He returned to his studies, avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. But his actions left an indelible mark. Unwittingly, he taught a lesson that transcended any lecture. A lesson about standing up for what you believe in, not with anger or defensiveness, but with grace and conviction. The story carried a powerful moral. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, it takes courage to stand up for justice and humanity. Respect does not diminish critical thinking. It enriches it, reminding us that even in disagreement, we can choose compassion over ridicule. As the semester progressed, the students who witnessed that moment carried its message with them, and the ripple effect continued to spread, far beyond Whitmore University. So next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment, stop and ask yourself if you're challenging the idea or dismantling the person. If this story resonated with you, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more thoughtful stories. Let's keep the conversation going.